I just think that calling someone a neocon because you have a philosophical disagreement that we should stand with Ukraine was sloppy.
But Representative, for one, the argument wasn't that the U.S. shouldn't stand with Ukraine, whatever that means.
Or even if you have a disagreement on that, I think we should be providing weapons.
Right.
That doesn't make me a neocon.
But the second part is that he said that you sound like a neocon. And in fact, in his tweet, he was drawing a contrast between your laudable record that you just articulated and the kinds of statements you were making. The fact of his surprise and disappointment was exactly because of your long record of being very good on these kinds of issues. It wasn't saying you are a neocon. It's saying that this is a language that sounds like what a neocon would say to justify any number of interventions. And it is surprising and in some ways disappointing to hear you using that kind of language. Do you see a difference there?
I see a difference. I mean, I think maybe that subtlety didn't come through, but if that was his intent, I still think that what the neocon vision is that the United States should militarily intervene in places to create a liberal democracy. That is not what's happening here. I'm not saying that the United States should go in militarily even to defend Ukraine, which is the president has been clear we're not going to do with our troops, let alone that the United States should be going anywhere to create democracy. That's very different than saying that we shouldn't be providing arms to a country that is being attacked and facing human rights violations. I don't think that supporting a just war, or in some cases even supporting if a NATO country was attacked, or I do think a military response would be appropriate. I don't think that you have to be opposed to all military action unless your homeland is directly attacked to be progressive on foreign policy. I believe that there are things like just wars. There are times where national security is at stake where the United States does need to lead. But I don't think that having our military extended to promote and create liberal democracy is a successful use. And that's where I would differ. And then I just pointed out, I certainly didn't intend to smear Max. I was just pointing out that the facts, as I was told, that he has contributed to Russian TV. I don't see why if he wants to do that, that's his right. And I think it's just a matter of factual record.
What do you think about the RT ban?
Well, I think you mean on Facebook?
And so RT Europe has been flatly banned. RT America is off Twitter, or RT America, I think, had to shut down because of sanctions and is no longer on Twitter.
Yeah, because they were engaged in such brutal propaganda and misinformation. I think, given the context of the war, that was appropriate. There are places, perfectly other appropriate places of dissent, but I don't think we need to give Putin, who is engaged in basically war crimes, a platform for spreading misinformation around the world. That doesn't mean.
Can you cite an example of the kind of propaganda that you've observed on RT?
Well, I haven't personally looked through the articles, but my understanding from the reporting is that you had a false narrative of blaming the United States for this blatant aggression, of basically not acknowledging that Putin's own writing, that he believes in a greater Russia, of casting this as the fault of the West, as opposed to acknowledging that this is just an act of conquest. So if there were an academic in the United States, and there are, who have a different perspective, I'm all for them publishing. I'm all for robust debate. But I don't think we ought to be giving a dictator like Putin a platform to spout his message at the same time that he's killing women and children. That's not free speech.
So Chris Hedges is an academic. He's a professor at Princeton, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, longtime journalist at the New York Times, who had a show on RT that was canceled as a consequence of this. The record, the historical record, the archive of these shows in many cases is missing forever. And there have been journalists like Abby Martin, who was recently on Bad Faith podcast, who are quite notable for being openly antagonistic and critical of Russia and Putin in the context of the 2014 coup. Do you see a similar level of criticism of America's involvement and role in the 2014 coup in Ukraine in the mainstream news? And are you yourself critical of America's role with Victoria Nuland and the like in 2014?
Well, first of all, I would defend the Princeton professor or the other journalists' ability to have their views. They don't have to go on Russia TV. There are plenty of outlets in the United States or Europe or
Are
other
there?
places. Absolutely, that they can get on. And I mean, if he's tenured at Princeton, that's a pretty privileged position to be in that can have your views heard. And I would defend his right of free speech and to publish, to be heard, to be on podcasts, to go on. And absolutely, we ought to do that. Now, on the situation, I think, in what happened in 2014, I mean, I'd have to read up more. I don't want to be opining on something that I don't know all the details, but I don't think in any way it's comparable to Russia going in and invading Ukraine and bombing. It's not like we had some military involvement in trying to change the Ukrainian government, where that's what Russia is doing. But,
why is the line military involvement, though, Representative? The issue is that the way that America does regime change is 99% non-military. The reality is that it's used its democracy building arms, the CIA, the State Department, to do regime change across the world. And you're very familiar with this fact. So it's not to draw false equivalencies or say that it is absolving Putin for the invasion. But the left has been trying to ring the alarm and just simply allude to the reality that Putin is responding to a number of geopolitical events, some of which were caused by the United States of America. And doing so has caused people, including Max Blumenthal, to be accused of being Putin's puppet just for speaking to the historical record.
I've never would condone anyone making that accusation without hard evidence. I mean, if you're going to say that someone is Putin's puppet, you better have hard evidence that they are getting paid or influenced by Putin. And I certainly have never called anyone that and wouldn't unless I had hard evidence of that. I think that is fear mongering that I reject. But the same thing on 2014. I mean, my understanding is that you had a leader who wanted to be tilted towards the West and then Europe and reconsidered it. But if you're going to say the United States had some role that they shouldn't have, I would want to see hard evidence of exactly what they did. And I admit that I am not familiar with all of the details there and will be open post this war right now, because I think that we shouldn't be giving Putin an excuse to justify something that is 100% morally wrong. We should have an open conversation, and I'd be open to looking at the details. But we can't just sling accusations also or allegations without hard evidence on that. I mean, when people say the United States role, what specifically was the United States role?
Well, Representative Khanna, the hard evidence that most people point to most concretely is leaked calls of Victoria Nuland actively having a conversation in which they pick Ukraine's next leader, and the person that was selected did, in fact, become the leader of Ukraine.
The audio clip of a woman and man said to be Nuland and Payet. Here's them discussing strategies to work with the three main opposition figures.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week.
And as a member of the, House Armed Services Committee, as someone with the foreign policy bona fides, as you do, I feel like some members of our audience are going to be a little incredulous that this aspect of the historical narrative is coming as a surprise. But perhaps they shouldn't be surprised, because this is exactly why outlets like RT are so valuable to so many Americans, because the mainstream news does not allow any of this narrative to permeate it at all. And you're surprised that someone who's a tenured professor at Princeton wouldn't get on TV. I mean, even Cornel West has spoken about how he can almost never get on the news. It happens very infrequently. There are a handful of hosts here and there who are sympathetic to him and allow him come on in some limited capacity. But he's one of the greatest public intellectuals, and he is not able to get an airing on MSNBC or CNN most cases.
Let me just say on both of those cases, first of all, I have a great admiration for Cornel West. We campaigned together for Bernie Sanders. He was on CNN and MSNBC during the Sanders campaign, and
infrequently. And,
you
and,
know,
and my understanding is he has a friend at CNN, but MSNBC is a really hard sell. And I can speak to that being the case personally.
his book, Race Matters, is brilliant. He's one of the brilliant thinkers. And so I have great admiration for him. And I agree that we need voices like his. On 2014, we can look. I've read some of the articles. I read Mearsheimer on it. I'm not saying that there's not a time for that debate. I'm just saying that there has to be precision. Just saying that the United States may have wanted someone to ascend doesn't mean that the United States engineered that. And I think before we throw out those kind of terms, we have to really have a lot of evidence and research on it. And I don't think this is the time to have that conversation, because Putin takes some of those and uses it for justification for killing women and children. I think it is perfectly appropriate when this war ends. And if we want to look at the entire historical record and have a debate and say, what can we do to make sure that we are learning the lessons of history, then let's have a wide debate. But now let's focus on supporting the Ukrainians and making sure women and children are not dying.
I would suggest that part of having the war end is understanding the historical perspective that is motivating Putin, and understanding his motivations will help us get to a better place at the bargaining table more quickly. And this was the initial point that I raised, that if you are open to the idea that NATO expansion was a huge issue that provoked this conflict, which was not something that could be said out loud 3 weeks ago without, again, getting you accused of being Putin's puppet, which is now one of the main issues that's being negotiated around right now, guarantees against further NATO expansion. If we could have been having these conversations earlier, I would argue that many fewer women and children needed to die in order for this conflict to be resolved. And if America hadn't been instigating and pushing further NATO expansion, including George Bush saying that that Ukraine should join NATO, that we perhaps would not have gone down this rabbit hole to begin with and ended up here in the first place.
I just respectfully disagree with that perspective. I am not saying that there's two different issues. If you read Putin's own writing in an article he published a year ago, you would see, in my view, that Putin is saying that he believes in the greater Russia and he wants to take over Ukraine because it's part of Russia. I think that is the motive. We can have a separate conversation about whether Bush in 2008 or whenever he did it should have promised NATO to Ukraine, given that the West never expected or to deliver on it in the near term. And that's a separate conversation that I think should be debated. But I don't think that was the cause of this war. I personally believe that Putin was going to do this because of his vision for a greater Russia. I know there are people who disagree with me on that, but that's my view.
Well, help me understand, why is Putin's writing on his vision of a greater Russia dispositive here and taken as a kind of a matter of fact about what his mental state and motivations are? But George Bush's statements about Ukraine becoming a part of NATO were supposed to count as just an offhanded remark that no one should have had any kind of geopolitical reliance on.
No, I'm saying obviously those may have had consequences that we ought to look at and debate. But I don't think that's the cause of this war. I think the cause of this war, whether NATO expanded or not, I don't think would have prevented Putin from going in to Ukraine. I think he was hell-bent on restoring the Soviet Union, and that's illegal. That's a separate question from, did we make a promise that we couldn't keep, and should we have made that promise, and did we lead Ukraine to believe something that wasn't possible? And that's a legitimate academic debate that we should have in this country. But what I think that the frustration I think some people have is when that is linked to the NATO expansion argument to saying that's why Putin's invading. No, because that's putting some blame on the United States, which I don't put in this context. Genuinely, I think this is Putin making something illegal. Now, I also want to defend free speech, just because I disagree with that perspective. I don't think Putin invading was because of NATO's expansion. If someone is saying that, I don't think that makes them a Putin puppet. You can just disagree with them without name calling.
So you don't think that America has played any role in this conflict?
I wouldn't say any role. I would say that in the context of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, I put 100% of the blame on Putin. I don't blame the United States for Putin's decision to go in and invade a sovereign country. Just like if Russia did aggressive things in Europe and then we decided to go invade Canada, I wouldn't say, well, Russia is to blame. I would say, no, the United States is invading a sovereign country that's wrong. So Putin is chosen to invade a sovereign country, and he's written that he wants to restore Russia. He's 100% in the wrong. In this case, America is 100% in the right. We're standing in the just fight. That's my.
I think 100% is the problem. You're an attorney, right, Representative Khanna? You understand the concept of contributory negligence.
I do.
You know, it does not mean that someone else is absolved of their role in a problem, in a conflict, in a car crash, just because there is a contributory negligent party. If party A is driving drunk, but party B runs the red light, it does not make it okay that party A is drunk, that party B is the one that might have been the but-for cause of the accident. And I think that all that people are asking is to be honest about the reality of America's ongoing regime change efforts across the world, which you in so many other contexts have been such an assiduous highlighter of.
Well, I think I would say we're contributory negligent in Yemen by aiding the Saudis. So it's not like
But not in Ukraine.
I don't think so. I really don't. I think that in Ukraine, you really have Putin's aggression that is the cause. And I think that the cause of that is Putin wanting to restore a greater Russia. I know there are people who disagree with that perspective. That's my genuine belief that this is a country that's under attack, that sovereignty is being threatened, that women and children are being killed, and we're doing the just thing by coming to their aid and providing them weapons to have this fight. And that we're, in this case, 100% in the right and Putin's 100% in the wrong. There are times, look, I thought we were in the wrong in invading Iraq. I thought we were in the wrong in what we did in Libya. I thought we were in the wrong in what we're doing with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So it's not like I am always saying the United States, whatever we do is 100% right. In this
Except
case,
in this instance, you do think that what
because
America's doing is 100% right.
I do. I think in the light of the circumstance, the president's gotten the policy right here. And that's why I've supported him strongly on his policy.
But the president getting the policy right now that Putin has invaded, and many on the left agree that they very much appreciate he's not playing games with this no-fly zone, despite the rabid pro-war interest of much of the U.S. press corps. But Biden behaving appropriately in this instance, is not the same thing as American foreign policy over the past 10 or 20 or 30 years, having not contributed meaningfully to this conflict. That is not the same thing as saying America is responsible for a Russian soldier putting a bullet in a Ukrainian citizen. But it is relevant if you want to unwind this process. And I just will say again that it is kind of incredible to believe that NATO expansion plays no role when conversations about limiting NATO expansion, halting NATO expansion are so central to the negotiations ongoing right now.
Well, I would say that it gives no justification for Putin to do what he did. And I think the fact that Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia are in NATO probably provides some protection from Putin further invading. But we can have the conversation of where NATO's lines should be drawn. And that's a debate worth having afterwards. And I would say in Ukraine situation, let's see what Zelensky and the Ukrainian people want. And let's support them in having a negotiated end to this war. But I guess the point which I was making, pushing back on Max on the left, is I would love people like Max, and I don't think he represents the left, but why aren't people like him saying Putin is in the wrong? Putin, or maybe he is. I don't want to put words in his mouth.
Putin does, and that's part of the issue that leftists like Putin, like Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate do clearly condemn Putin's invasion, and that does not preclude them from being characterized the way they are repeatedly characterized. And I think that is why the tweet caused so much consternation on the left. Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.